The Earth is over 4,600 million years old. For nearly all of that time, the planet was a world of only plants and animals. Our own story doesn't begin until the very last epoch, the Quaternary, which started just 2 million years ago and continues to this day. These early ancestors, the Australopithecus, were more ape than human. They walked on 2 legs, but possessed brain cases of just 400 cubic centimeters. They were proto-humans, creatures operating within the strict physical boundaries of the African savanna. To survive, they organized into small bands of about 25 people. While these groups formed larger alliances for mutual aid, they were physically limited by the calories they could gather and the predators they avoided. In these early millennia, survival depended entirely on the strength of the group. Without tools or fire, humans remained integrated into the fauna. They were participants in the ecosystem, not its masters, trapped within a biological loop where survival was a daily uncertainty. The first significant shift arrived with Homo habilis, the handyman, who began to use fractured stone. These tools allowed humans to chop and to dig and to skin, extending their physical capabilities through technology. By the time Homo erectus appeared, these tools were being used alongside fire. This allowed groups to stay warm in colder climates and provided protection from wild animals, enabling them to travel long distances out of Africa and into the Indian subcontinent. This era also saw the beginning of ritual. At Bembeka, we see paintings of the animals these people hunted for subsistence. This wasn't a pursuit of aesthetics, but a practical ritual meant to ensure control over the wild animals that their lives depended on. However, around 12,000 BC, the Ice Age ended. The climate became rainy and warm, causing a sudden explosion of dense vegetation and forests. The open grasslands where humans had hunted for millennia disappeared, replaced by a landscape that required a completely different approach to survival. The old nomadic hunting practices were no longer enough in this thick, new environment. The very success of their survival through the Ice Age had brought them to a landscape where their ancient methods were becoming obsolete. Humans responded by shifting from gathering to production. In the Mesolithic Age, they began domesticating animals, and by 7000 BC, the first Neolithic settlers in places like Mergar were clearing land to plant wheat and barley. Agriculture required a new toolkit. Neolithic people moved away from simple chipped stones toward tools shaped by grinding and polishing. These polished axes and hoes were designed for the heavy labor of tilling earth and clearing forests. As these farming communities grew, they built permanent structures. At sites across the Indus Plains, we find mud brick granaries used to store surplus grain, evidence of a society that had finally stopped moving and started to build. This map shows the distribution of these early Neolithic sites. While the people had mastered farming, they were still limited by their materials. They relied entirely on stone, which meant they had to live where stone was easily accessible. You can see the result in the clustering of these settlements. They are concentrated on the slopes of hills and in hilly river valleys. The vast, fertile central plains remain empty because they lacked the specific types of stone needed for grinding and polishing tools. The Neolithic farmers had unlocked the food supply, but their stone tools kept them anchored to the rocky fringes of the subcontinent, unable to move into the deep, soft soils of the interior. The discovery of copper sparked the Chalcolithic Age, allowing settlements to spread over a much wider area. In western Maharashtra, fortified villages like Daimabad grew to accommodate thousands of people, organized under the rule of local chiefs. But copper brought its own limitations. It is a soft, pliant metal. Without knowing how to mix it with tin to create bronze, a much stronger alloy, their tools remained too weak for the most difficult agricultural tasks. This was particularly true in the Deccan and central India, home to black cotton soil. During the dry season, this earth becomes incredibly hard and clay-like, making it nearly impossible to break with basic tools. Because their copper and stone implements couldn't penetrate this dense clay, these farmers were restricted to surface-level jume or slash-and-burn cultivation. They couldn't plow the earth deeply, which severely limited the amount of food they could produce from the land. Even with the leap into metallurgy, these communities were mismatched against the geography. Their soft copper tools couldn't generate the massive surpluses required for the rise of true cities. The inability to farm intensively had a human cost. Despite their knowledge of agriculture, Chalcolithic people struggled with nutrition. They often didn't milk their cattle, and their diets were frequently insufficient to support a growing population. Archaeological excavations in Maharashtra reveal the scale of this struggle through the burial of large numbers of children. These infants were buried in urns beneath the floors of their homes, victims of a society that had reached the absolute limit of what its technology could provide. When rainfall began to decline around 1200 BC, these fragile communities in western India collapsed. Unable to adapt their farming to the drying climate, most of these settlements disappeared entirely. These people pushed stone and copper as far as the materials would allow. They occupied the semi-arid riverine tracts for centuries, but they were eventually overcome by an environment their tools simply couldn't master. The disappearance of these western settlements was not the end of the story. While the communities in the west faded, those in the red soil areas of the east faced a different transition. In eastern India and the mid-Gangetic plains, there was no gap. These Chalcolithic farmers transitioned directly into the Iron Age. They brought with them the dietary habits they had spent centuries perfecting, the cultivation of rice and fish in the east, and the barley and wheat staples of the west. We often focus on the grand Bronze Age cities of the Indus Valley, but those urban centers were the exception. The rural Chalcolithic villages represent the lived reality of the majority of the subcontinent's early inhabitants. These early groups spent thousands of years identifying the crops and locations that could support human life. They stayed in the river junctions and the upland hills, maintaining a foothold until the arrival of iron finally allowed their descendants to move into the plains